Picture this. Final table, World Series of Poker main event. 10,000 players started. 9 remain. The stacks are even. The blinds are crushing. $100 million in prize money sits on that felt. Cameras everywhere. Your heart is trying to break through your chest. Your hands won't stop shaking. And across the table you see him, the monster, stone-faced, breathing steady, eyes locked. While everyone else is drowning in cortisol, he's hunting. This is where poker stops being a card game and becomes a survival test. This is where all your solver study, all your range memorization, all your technical mastery either holds or shatters. Because when pressure peaks, when the stakes reach that critical threshold where your nervous system goes into overdrive, something terrifying happens. Most players disappear. They're physically present but psychologically absent. Their prefrontal cortex shuts down. Their amygdala takes over. They become ghosts at their own final table. But not the monsters. The monsters thrive here. They've trained for this exact moment. Not just their poker skills, but their neurological response to extreme stress. They've built something that 99% of players never develop: pressure immunity. And that's what separates a good player from a world champion. That's what turns a talented grinder into a legend. Let me tell you about Stu Ungar, 3-time World Series of Poker main event champion. The only player besides Johnny Moss to achieve that. But here's what made Stu a monster. He didn't just play well under pressure. He played better. His famous 10-high call against Mansour Matloubi, where he precisely identified his opponent's exact hand and called with nothing. That wasn't luck. That was a brain operating at maximum capacity while his opponent was in full panic mode. Stu's genius-level IQ and photographic memory were tools, but his true edge was neurological. Under maximum stress, when everyone else's decision-making degraded, his sharpened. Now here's the brutal part. Stu's story ends tragically, dead at 45 in a Vegas motel. Addiction destroyed what pressure couldn't. And that reveals the paradox of monsters. The same psychological wiring that makes you unstoppable under competitive pressure can make you vulnerable to self-destruction outside competition. The monster doesn't just dominate the table. The monster needs the table. Remove the pressure, remove the competition, and the monster has nothing to regulate those extreme neurological patterns. This is what nobody tells you about peak performance under pressure. It's not just about being tough. It's about developing a specific brain architecture that can maintain executive function when stress hormones are flooding your system. Let me break down what's actually happening neurologically when pressure peaks. Your amygdala is your threat detector. When it perceives danger, whether physical or psychological, it triggers your sympathetic nervous system. Your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate spikes. Your blood pressure rises. Blood flow shifts away from your prefrontal cortex toward your limbic system and motor cortex. This is fight or flight. It's ancient, it's automatic, and it's designed to help you run from predators or fight for survival. But poker doesn't need fight or flight. Poker needs calculation. It needs strategic thinking. It needs working memory. It needs impulse control. All prefrontal cortex functions. And under extreme pressure, that's exactly what shuts down first. This is why you see players making calls they know are wrong. This is why smart professionals punt off chips with terrible bluffs. This is why technically sound players turn into fish when they reach a final table. Their hardware can't run the software under pressure. The monster's brain works differently. Through specific training, through deliberate exposure to pressure, through neurological conditioning, they've built what researchers call stress inoculation. Their amygdala still fires. They still feel the pressure. But their prefrontal cortex stays online. They can still think strategically. They can still calculate. They can still read opponents. While you're in survival mode, they're in execution mode. Research on elite military operators shows this exact pattern. Navy SEALs don't have lower stress responses than civilians. Their bodies release the same hormones. Their hearts race just as fast. But their training has created neural pathways that keep cognitive function intact despite physiological arousal. They can problem solve while getting shot at. They can make tactical decisions while exhausted and terrified. That's not natural. That's engineered. Poker monsters engineer the same capacity. They don't avoid pressure. They seek it. They put themselves in situations where the stakes feel crushing, where their nervous system screams danger, and they force themselves to execute strategy anyway. Hand after hand, session after session, tournament after tournament. They're not building confidence. They're building stress tolerance at the neurological level. If you've ever felt your game completely fall apart under pressure, drop a comment right now, because what I'm about to show you is how to build monster-level stress immunity. Here's what most players get wrong about pressure performance. They think it's about staying calm. It's not. Research shows that trying to suppress your stress response actually makes performance worse. You can't think your way out of an amygdala hijack. You can't use willpower to keep your prefrontal cortex online when your body is in threat mode. That's not how neurology works. The monster doesn't suppress the stress response. The monster uses it. That adrenaline? That's energy. That elevated heart rate? That's oxygen delivery. That narrowed focus? That's distraction elimination. The physiological arousal that destroys most players becomes fuel for monsters, but only if they've trained the interpretation. This is where Fedor Holz's philosophy becomes critical. Fedor talks about future game, not just the current hand, but 3 hands from now, 5 hands from now, the final table dynamic an hour from now. This kind of strategic thinking requires massive prefrontal cortex engagement. Most players can't do this even when relaxed. Under pressure? Impossible, unless you're a monster. Unless you've specifically trained your brain to maintain this level of processing under stress. Now let's talk about what actually creates a monster. Because this isn't about genetics. This isn't about having ice in your veins or being naturally fearless. This is about systematic psychological conditioning combined with strategic skill development. And the gap between players who do this and players who don't is widening exponentially. The first component is exposure architecture. You can't build pressure immunity by avoiding pressure. You have to deliberately design experiences that trigger your stress response and then force yourself to perform anyway. But here's the critical part. The exposure has to be calibrated. Too little stress and you don't adapt. Too much stress and you just traumatize yourself. You need the sweet spot. What researchers call optimal stress. Think about how Jonathan Tamayo won the 2024 main event. He was down to 10 big blinds on day 4. Should have been eliminated, but he shoved ace-queen, won the flip, and survived. Then he makes the final table as one of the shorter stacks. Folds pocket queens to a single raise, gets roasted by the poker world, and then proceeds to outlast everyone and win $60 million with 8-3 against top pair on the final hand. That's not just luck. That's someone who's been in pressure situations so many times that his brain has adapted. But here's what most players miss about exposure training. It's not enough to just play more big tournaments. You need deliberate practice of pressure moments. You need simulations. You need to put yourself in spots where you're uncomfortable, where the stakes feel high, where your heart rate elevates, and then you execute your strategy perfectly regardless of outcome. You're training the neurological pattern. Stress occurs. Prefrontal cortex stays engaged. Strategic execution continues. The second component is reframing physiology. Your body's stress response is giving you signals: elevated heart rate, sweaty palms, butterflies in stomach, muscle tension. Most players interpret these as fear or anxiety. I'm too nervous to play well. That interpretation reinforces the stress. It creates a negative feedback loop. You feel stressed, you interpret it as inability, you perform worse, which validates the interpretation. Monsters interpret the exact same sensations differently. My body is getting ready, I'm alert, I'm focused, this is peak state. Same physiology, completely different psychological meaning, and the meaning determines whether those sensations enhance or impair performance. Research on this is crystal clear. Athletes who interpret arousal as excitement perform significantly better than those who interpret it as anxiety. Here's how to train this. Before every high-pressure session, deliberately induce physiological arousal. Do 50 burpees, sprint in place, get your heart racing, get your breathing heavy. Then immediately sit down and play your most technical strategic game. You're training your brain to associate elevated arousal with peak performance. Over time, this becomes automatic. The pressure hits, your physiology responds, and your brain says game time instead of danger. The third component is decision-making under cognitive load. When pressure peaks, your working memory capacity shrinks. You can't hold as many variables simultaneously. Complex calculations become difficult. This is why even skilled players make obvious mistakes at final tables. Their mental RAM is overwhelmed. So you need to build cognitive load tolerance. Practice this explicitly. Set up decision-making scenarios where you have to calculate multiple variables while simultaneously processing other information. Maybe you're reviewing a hand while someone's talking to you. Maybe you're calculating pot odds while music is playing. You're training your brain to maintain strategic thinking despite distractions and limitations. This transfers directly to pressure situations where your cognitive capacity is naturally limited. The fourth component is what I call strategic automation. Under extreme pressure, you need to make certain decisions automatically so you can allocate limited cognitive resources to the most critical variables. Your pre-flop ranges should be so deeply ingrained that you don't need to think about them. Your continuation betting strategy on common textures should be instant. This frees up mental bandwidth for the complex spots, the opponent-specific adjustments, the river decisions that actually determine outcomes. This is why solvers are so valuable for pressure performance. Not because you'll play GTO at a final table, you won't, but because drilling GTO patterns creates baseline automation. When your prefrontal cortex is partially offline due to stress, you can still execute sound fundamental strategy because it's encoded at a deeper level. The fifth component is opponent exploitation under pressure. Here's where monsters really separate themselves. Most players, when stressed, can barely execute their own strategy. Monsters can maintain strategic thinking and simultaneously exploit opponent weaknesses. They notice when opponents are making fear-based decisions. They identify when someone's stress response is causing leaks, and they attack ruthlessly. Think about what this means. Your opponent is at a final table. They've never been here before. Their stress response is in overdrive. They're playing scared. They're overfolding. They're checking strong hands. They're transparent. The monster sees all of this clearly because their own stress response isn't impairing their observational capacity. So while everyone else is just trying to survive, the monster is actively hunting. This is why final tables often come down to one or two players who seem to have all the chips. They're the monsters. Everyone else fed them. The sixth component is recovery protocols. And this is where most players fail catastrophically. They think grinding through pressure builds toughness. It doesn't. It builds trauma, builds repeated exposure to extreme stress without adequate recovery doesn't create adaptation. It creates burnout. It degrades performance. It eventually breaks you. Monsters understand recovery is part of the training. After high-pressure sessions, they decompress. They process the experience. They let their nervous system return to baseline. They sleep. They exercise. They engage in activities completely unrelated to poker. This isn't weakness. This is how you build sustainable pressure tolerance. Your nervous system needs the contrast. High stress followed by genuine recovery creates adaptation. Constant stress creates deterioration. The seventh component is purpose anchoring. When pressure peaks, you need something bigger than the immediate moment to stabilize your psychology. If you're playing for ego validation, pressure will destroy you because every hand becomes an identity threat. If you're playing for money you desperately need, pressure will crush you because every decision feels like survival. Monsters play for something else. Maybe it's mastery. Maybe it's the competition itself. Maybe it's proving something to themselves. Whatever it is, it's not dependent on this specific hand or this specific tournament. This psychological anchor keeps them stable. The hand doesn't matter. The opponent doesn't matter. The result doesn't matter. What matters is executing their process at the highest possible level. That detachment is paradoxically what allows peak performance. Because when everything matters, nothing works. When only the process matters, everything works. The eighth component is pattern recognition at speed. Under pressure, you don't have time for lengthy analysis. You need to recognize situations quickly and access the appropriate strategy instantly. This requires building a massive library of patterns through study and experience. But more importantly, it requires training rapid pattern recognition under stress. You can build this through specific drills. Flashcard-style hand scenarios where you have 5 seconds to make a decision. Rapid-fire solver work where you categorize spots quickly. Video review at increased speed. You're training your brain to process poker situations faster. And speed plus accuracy under pressure is what defines monster-level play. So how do you actually become a monster? How do you transform from someone who collapses under pressure into someone who thrives in it? Let me give you the exact training protocol that elite performers use to build pressure immunity. Week 1 through 4, baseline pressure exposure. You're going to play sessions specifically designed to trigger moderate stress, not your regular game. Play one level higher than you're comfortable with. Play against opponents who intimidate you. Put money on the line that makes you nervous. The goal isn't to win. The goal is to maintain strategic execution while experiencing stress. After each session, journal 3 things: what stress signals you noticed, how you interpreted them, and where your decision-making degraded. Week 5 through 8, physiological training. Before every session, do a 5-minute high-intensity workout. Get your heart rate to 140 plus. Then immediately start playing with 0 recovery time. You're training your brain to perform while physiologically aroused. Additionally, practice box breathing between hands. 4 counts in, 4 hold, 4 out, 4 hold. This activates parasympathetic response, bringing your nervous system back to baseline. You're building the capacity to regulate your physiology consciously. Week 9 through 12, cognitive load training. You're going to deliberately impair your cognitive capacity while playing. Set a timer that beeps every 30 seconds, forcing you to count backwards by 7s from 1,000. Or play while solving math problems. Or have news playing in the background. This sounds absurd, but you're training your brain to maintain strategic thinking despite limitations. When real pressure hits and your working memory naturally shrinks, you'll have practiced performing anyway. Week 13 through 16, simulation training. Create artificial pressure scenarios. Play tournament satellites where missing the bubble costs real money. Make prop bets with friends on session results. Anything that creates actual consequences and triggers genuine stress. The more realistic the pressure, the better the adaptation. But here's critical. After each pressure session, do a full debrief. Not just I won or I lost. Analyze your decision-making quality. Identify specific moments where pressure affected you. Track your progress over time. But training is only half the equation. The other half is understanding the monster's mindset at a philosophical level. And this is where it gets deep. Monsters don't just tolerate pressure, they need it. Remove pressure, and they feel nothing. This is both their superpower and their curse. Let me explain why this matters for your development. When you train pressure immunity, you're not just building a skill, you're changing your identity. You're becoming someone who feels most alive when stakes are highest. This is addictive. It's why Stu Ungar couldn't stay away from gambling even when it destroyed him. It's why so many poker champions struggle with other addictions. They've optimized their neurology for extreme competition, and normal life feels unbearably flat by comparison. You need to understand this before you go down this path. Building monster-level pressure tolerance means accepting that regular experiences will feel less intense. You'll need the competition. You'll crave the pressure. And if poker becomes unavailable, you'll seek intensity elsewhere. This isn't a character flaw. This is a neurological adaptation to training extreme stress tolerance. Know what you're signing up for. But if you accept that trade-off, if you commit fully to becoming a monster, here's what you need to do daily. First, exposure maintenance. You can't build pressure tolerance and then coast. You have to maintain it. Every week, put yourself in at least one situation that triggers genuine stress. Could be poker, could be public speaking, could be competitive athletics. Whatever it is, you need the hit of pressure to keep your adaptation current. Second, recovery rigor. Schedule mandatory off days, non-negotiable. During these days, zero poker, zero strategic thinking. You decompress completely. Go to nature. Exercise. Spend time with people you love. Let your nervous system fully recover. This isn't optional. This is how you avoid burnout and maintain peak capacity long-term. Third, purpose work. Regularly examine why you're doing this. Not surface reasons, deep reasons. What does this pursuit mean to you? What are you proving? What are you becoming? Keep your purpose clear. Because when you're in the middle of a pressure cooker, purpose is the only thing that keeps you anchored. Fourth, skill sharpening. Never stop studying. Never stop drilling. Your strategic foundation needs to be so solid that even when pressure reduces your cognitive capacity by 50%, you're still playing at a high level. This means constant solver work, constant hand review, constant strategic refinement. The monster never stops sharpening. Fifth, competition seeking. Don't just play poker, compete in other domains. Jiu-jitsu, chess, competitive gaming, anything where pressure exists and outcomes matter. You're training the general capacity to perform under stress. This transfers across domains. The more contexts you can maintain performance in, the more robust your pressure tolerance becomes. Now let's talk about the final table specifically, because this is where everything converges. You've trained. You've built your capacity. You've made it. Now you're sitting at the biggest final table of your life. What actually happens in your brain, and how do you optimize it? The first hour is critical. Your adrenaline is spiking. Your attention is hyperactive. Your decision-making is actually impaired even though you feel alert. Monsters know this, so they play tight the first hour, not because they're scared, because they know their neurology needs time to stabilize. They make simple decisions. They avoid marginal spots. They give their prefrontal cortex time to fully engage despite the stress response. After that first hour, the adrenaline starts to normalize. Your thinking clears. This is when monsters attack. They've conserved energy while everyone else was burning it on early anxious plays. Now, they're fully online while opponents are starting to fatigue. This is the hunting window. This is when they accumulate chips. This is when they exploit everyone who's still in panic mode. Deep into the final table, fatigue becomes the enemy. You've been playing for hours. Cognitive resources are depleted. Stress is cumulative. This is when monsters rely on their automation, the patterns they've drilled thousands of times, the baseline strategy that requires minimal thought. They're not trying to make genius plays anymore. They're executing fundamentals flawlessly while everyone else is making exhausted mistakes. On the bubble and at ICM pressure points, monsters do something counterintuitive. They loosen up. While everyone else is tightening from fear of busting, monsters are attacking aggressively because they recognize something fundamental. When everyone is scared, aggression is maximally effective. They're not gambling. They're exploiting the predictable fear response of the table. In heads-up play, monsters shift again. Now it's pure psychology, reads, patterns, adjustments. The technical stuff matters less. What matters is who can maintain strategic thinking longer. Who can read opponent tendencies while their own brain is screaming exhaustion. This is where years of pressure training pays off. The monster can still think. The opponent is running on fumes. Here's what I need you to understand about all of this. Becoming a monster isn't comfortable. It's not easy. It requires you to deliberately put yourself in situations that trigger stress, discomfort, and fear. It requires you to train when you'd rather rest. It requires you to face weaknesses you'd prefer to ignore. Most players never do this. They play poker hoping to magically develop pressure tolerance through osmosis. It doesn't work that way. But if you commit to this path, if you systematically build your pressure immunity, something remarkable happens. The situations that used to terrify you start to energize you. The final tables that used to feel overwhelming start to feel like home. The pressure that used to break you starts to sharpen you. You don't become fearless. You become someone who performs brilliantly while afraid. That's what a monster is. Not someone who doesn't feel pressure, someone who functions at peak capacity despite feeling it. Someone who's trained their neurology so thoroughly that stress no longer impairs performance. Someone who's been in the fire so many times that they've adapted to the heat. The poker world is full of talented players who never reach their potential because pressure breaks them. They have the skills, they have the knowledge, they have everything except pressure immunity. And when the moment comes, when the stakes peak, when everything is on the line, they disappear. They become ghosts. But you don't have to be a ghost. You can become a monster. It takes deliberate training. It takes psychological work. It takes accepting discomfort as the price of excellence. But it's completely trainable. The monsters you see dominating final tables weren't born different. They built different. And you can build the same thing. So here's your choice. Continue playing poker the way you always have, hoping pressure tolerance somehow develops naturally. Or start training it systematically. Start seeking pressure. Start building your capacity. Start becoming a monster. Because when pressure peaks, when stakes are highest, when everyone else is drowning, only monsters remain. And they take everything. This is Mind of Grinder. If you're ready to stop being a ghost and start becoming a monster, subscribe right now. Drop a comment telling me what pressure situation you're going to deliberately train this week. Hit that like button if this changed how you see pressure performance. Because the champions of tomorrow are the ones who train pressure tolerance today. I'll see you when the stakes are highest.